Matt, welcome back to the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man.
Yeah. So I forget if I asked this. I don't really go back and listen to my old episodes. If I did, we
Right.
can just skip and move straight on. But did I ask you about your personal heavy metal history? So, like those records and bands that got you into the genre and how it's evolved for you over the years?
It's been so long, I don't remember, so I'm just going to answer.
Fair enough. Let's do it.
um, I, not to make a long story into a saga, but I guess when I was in sixth grade, this new kid transferred to our school. His name was Matt something. His name was also Matt. Anyway, we were going on a field trip, and he asked me, he's like, "Oh, are you into heavy metal?" And I was like, "What's heavy metal?" And I remember it's like, "Fucking pussy," and I was like, "What?" Anyway, and I never really got to know the kid or whatever, but I was like, "So what's heavy metal?" And mostly before that, I've been listening to my parents' music, and the only kind of like current stuff I think I was really excited about. This will give you an idea of how long ago this was like Run DMC, Beastie Boys, LL Cool J, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then I guess this would have been going into '87 because the new albums I remember were like the first Poison album was really big. I think the first Cinderella record was all over MTV. The Ozzy Randy tribute,
Oh,
the
shit.
live album. um, and so I kind of got interested in some of that stuff from MTV. And then I've always been a big reader. That was like my thing. So I remember buying, like, it probably was a Hit Parader or a Circus or something, and you get 12 tapes for a penny to join the fucking club.
Oh,
So I
yeah. I
sent
remember
away
that.
for the 12 tapes, and in there was that Aussie live thing, the White Snake self-titled, Somewhere in Time by Iron Maiden.
Oh, shit.
Um, uh, I think I got like Sacred Heart by Dio, which is not a great record, but I did get that live intermission cassette from Dio, and I
Yeah.
got the last line, which I liked a lot, um, and the first Wasp album. And then as I was kind of, 12 tapes is a lot for like an 11-year-old to get through, especially with the pre-internet brain where like you just
Right.
sat down and you just listened to the thing straight through, and I would always read the liner notes and read the lyrics. And so the last two cassettes I listened to, because I was kind of like, oh, I don't know about these, um, was Master of Puppets and Peace Sells, But Who's Buying? And I
Mm.
remember it would have been, I guess, late 1987, because I think there was like a Christmas tree in the living room. I remember sitting and listening to Master of Puppets on my little Walkman by myself. My parents had gone to bed, and I was like, what the fuck? Like, I heard Battery, and I was like, is this the wrong tape? Because this is like, I thought it was, my little brain was, is this like flamenco music? I don't think I even knew what that was, because then I thought, is this Spanish music? Because it has that sort of spaghetti Western thing. And
Yeah.
then I
Yeah.
heard Battery, and I was just like, I remember I took the headphones off, and I was like, I don't know what just happened. Like, what? And, from there, it sort of very quickly devolved. The Poison and White Snake tapes didn't get listened to anymore after that. And then, then it was Metallica, Megadeth, of course, Anthrax, Slayer. I got Rain and Blood at the store. And I remember I'd switched to a new school for seventh grade, and the cool teacher would let every kid in the class, like, play a cassette every, once a week or whatever.
Oh, damn.
I brought in Rain and Blood, and then that ended that policy. I ruined it for everybody. Um, and then as I started kind of learning a little bit more about, Metallica, Exodus, Slayer, whatever, then you learned about SOD, and then pretty soon it would be Cryptic Slaughter and DRI and Cro-Mags and Onslaught, Venom, Bathory, Creator, Sodom. So it just was sort of, it was a great time to get into metal, but it was kind of in my mind, it was a little bit of a bummer because I was a little bit behind. You know what I mean?
Right.
The new albums I remember, being excited about when they were new was like Justice, South of Heaven, So Far So Good So What. So it's like a little bit past the prime of thrash, and being a kid in the suburbs, obviously, again, no internet and no way my parents let me go to gigs. I was thinking that, the music was all about being as like fast and crazy as possible. And then you
Right.
hear South of Heaven and you're like, wait, I guess this isn't about being as fast as crazy as possible now. This is like kind of slow and moody. And thankfully that's when, cassettes like Under the Sign of the Black Mark by Bathory and like Scream Bloody Gore by Death came into my life. And those two in particular, I remember being like, I don't know about, like, this is kind of weird, like, huh. And then a friend of mine, a friend of a friend of mine, had the Leprosy tape, and he played that for me, and I was like, huh, because it was a little bit more audible. And
Yes.
then it clicked, and then I went back to the Scream Bloody Gore tape, and then I kind of was able to make sense of it. And then by 89, you're reading all these magazines and you started hearing about Beneath the Remains and Slowly We Rot and all this stuff. And so the words death metal just kind of kept coming up. And I was like, huh. As I was trying to figure out the death songs on guitar, I was like, this is different than, Metallica and Exodus or whatever. Like, there's no more blues riffs or whatever. Um, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it that clearly, but I could tell that the note combinations were kind of changing, and
Yeah.
that's when I became aware of some different. And then the next one I think that really like blew my fucking head off was the Napalm Death PL sessions, which I
Oh
suppose
yeah.
is more. But you know, our little friend group, like two different schools, like the only metal kids in two different schools. Um, there was me and the guy that became the original Exhumed drummer, Cole Jones, and then a couple of our friends. And Cole and I were always the ones like ready to push forward. And our friends were kind of like, well, I don't know, maybe like Creator or Corner. That's as far as we want to go. And then we started hearing, by 90, we were listening to like Napalm, Carcass, Bolt Thrower, Entombed, uh, Carnage, Cadaver. That split CD was a big deal for us. And our friends are kind of like, I don't know, you guys are weird. And, some of them split off and went away and, became normal and whatever. But, there's so many records, but I think the biggest ones are Master Puppets for sure. Scream Bloody Gore, and then the Napalm Death Peel sessions are the kind of three times when everything just kind of took a hard turn. It was like, oh shit, like,
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think the thing that I glean from that too that I I often kind of lose sight of because we are in modern times is, you had that lucky time to be discovering everything as it was coming out. So all that stuff was new. Whereas today, those genres have been like around forever. People know what to
Sure.
expect from them. It's a little harder to get people to be like, "Hey, we're a death metal band." Okay, well, what death metal band do you sound like? You know what I mean? Whereas like
Right.
when you were discovering everything, it was like, no, there's just death. There's just carcass. It's like there wasn't anything that sounded like those bands. And I think that you are lucky in that sense, getting to discover all those bands, growing up. Whereas now I feel like it's a lot harder to find something unique in that
I
way.
mean, I think that the biggest difference, honestly, is that in previous times there was a lack of information,
Yeah,
and that sounds like a downside, but it's actually can often be an upside, especially for a younger listener, because you have no expectation. Like literally, one of my favorite albums is The Force by Onslaught.
hmm
I didn't know anything about Onslaught, never heard of him before, never saw an ad in a magazine, nothing. I just would look through the cassettes and I was like, well, if it's on Metal Blade or if it was on Combat, I was like, maybe it might be good. And so I'd
yeah,
walk around the store for like a half hour and get like a stack of tapes to decide which one I was going to get. And The Force was on Combat, um, Music for Nations, and but in America on Combat. And the cover just had a pentagram, and the song titles were cool. It was like "Let There Be Death," "Flame of the Antichrist," "Demoniac," "Contract in Blood," and I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna roll the fucking dice. And it ended up becoming one of my favorite albums ever. So it's like I had no real preconceptions about it. You know what I mean? Nobody told
yeah,
me and I was an only child, so I didn't have like an older brother, or I didn't even have a cool cousin that was like, "Yo, kid, listen to this." Um, so it was really just sort of me and my, imagination, and a couple lucky times, because I think, if I would have got four shitty tapes in a row, I might have stopped buying them. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I happened to roll the dice and win. So I kept spending, my whole allowance was like one cassette tape and a Slurpee. That's what I could afford every week. And so if you got a cassette tape, that's the other thing too, is that because we had limited access, you spent more time with the record. If
Yeah.
I got a tape and I was like, well, I don't know, you're like, well, you wanted to like it because you spent $8.99 or $8.49 or whatever it was on the fucking tape. So you were like, well, I'll try it again. I'll listen to it again. Maybe I'll get it, and some things that, like the early Voivod stuff is really difficult to hear, and it's
Right.
pretty weird. And, I don't know that if I could have just fast forwarded on to the next thing and scrolled through 27,000 Bandcamp tabs, if I would have spent the time to really click with it. So it's all a trade-off. I don't want to romanticize the past, because having access to basically an infinite record collection at any given moment is amazing. And
Right.
I use Spotify all the fucking time. you
Same.
know um, it's great. It's an amazing tool. However, in that convenience, there are some things that you lose, and it's a different experience. And I think it's kind of fun to talk to people who are, a generation after me, and
Mhm.
hear about how they got into this stuff, because it's so weird to me. It's like, oh, I heard something on Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 or whatever, and then it's like, what the fuck? All right. Um, and I'm sure even, my wife is 32 and I'm pushing 50 here. And some of the stuff I'll tell her, she's like, what? And I was like, yeah, I walked to the record store. They didn't have what I wanted. So I had to bike like 10 miles across town to like go to the store. I had to call them and be like, you have Napalm Death, Harmony Corruption on tape? Okay. And I got on my bike and fucking rode all the way over there. She's like, you rode your bike 10 miles to buy a Napalm Death tape? I was like, yeah. She's like, you're an
Yeah.
idiot. I was like, no, I didn't have anything else going on,
Yeah.
you know. So it's all a trade-off, and I think it's what's great is that no matter what, people are interested in music, and people, want to have they want to have that experience with music, and everybody's experience is really unique and super special. And whether you heard it on fucking a video game thing, or your fucking older cousin played it for you in a garage in 1983, it's still awesome, and everybody's journey is really special to them, and that's kind of what makes the whole thing happen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I asked that question, because I find it interesting the way people discover stuff. I feel pretty lucky that I was like in that between era of like fully digital music and record stores. So like
Right.
I kind of did the same thing where I would go to a record store and look at the covers and be like, "Yo, that looks fucked up. Let's see what this is." And sometimes it would hit, and sometimes I wasted $20. It's what it is.
Absolutely. I mean, it's I do love that aspect of like, you're more invested in the music because you paid for it, and
Yeah.
so you kind of have to, and the fact that you're willing to take a chance and just dump money on something blindly is a cool leap of faith. That's something that I do feel a little nostalgic about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the thing that I do miss the most, like as far as like physical media, is I do really like having like the booklets and looking at the
Yeah.
lyrics and, discovering the other bands that people think like, or people think. You don't have that on Spotify really. It's just like the cover
No.
you can like look at real quickly and maybe some liner notes of who's in the band, and that's kind of it. But man, I remember I used to just like memorize lyrics that way. Like I still have
Oh
whole
yeah.
albums stuck in my head from reading those booklets over and over.
I'm in the exact same boat. I mean, and it was a really immersive experience that it's hard to duplicate today, even if you just sit down with a record, even if you buy the LP, because
Yeah.
you got 80,000 alerts on your phone. Or if you're like, oh, this part's not that interesting or whatever, you're just like, I'll just look at Instagram, and then you're like, oh shit, 5 minutes passed because I was like, looking at thirst traps, and you're like, oh fuck, I missed the whole song. Um, so it's just a whole different experience. And I think that the main thing that I'm concerned about now with streaming and everything moving to streaming is the whole idea of ownership.
Yeah.
And I am growing increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of my ability to listen to music that I love being at the mercy of whatever rights are allocated between these giant corporations that don't give a shit about me or this one record that I'm really looking for. And
Yeah.
so, I'm glad that I started buying LPs in the 90s because they were just cheap and interesting and fun. And I'm glad I kept all that stuff. And I got rid of a lot of my tapes, but I still have like, about 350 or so from back in the day.
Damn.
And, I try to, if there's something that I really, really like, and I try to buy it on vinyl, or if I go to a show, I'll try to buy the record just to have it, even though usually I'll listen to it on my phone
Sure.
like everybody else. But I just like the idea that nobody can take it away or change it, because that's, I guess, what I worry about, because the digital world is malleable in ways that the physical world is not. And and vice versa. So
Yeah.
it's I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm getting older and thinking about how the temporary nature of existence or whatever, or maybe because we're living in a world where corporations just sort of have found a way to profit off every single moment of every single day, whether it's listening to music or calling your friends or whatever. So I guess I'm wary of that.
No, I'm right there with you, man, because like, especially with streaming services, like not necessarily music, but like video stuff, I've been getting
Yeah.
so annoyed at how like something will be on one streaming service for however long. Maybe you don't feel like watching it, and then it's gone, and you're like, well, fuck, I want to watch that now. And
Right.
then like, it just like it's like the streaming service roulette. So I started going back to buying physical media myself. I've been like buying DVDs and fucking VHS. Like, there's
Right.
stuff that's on VHS that was never put anywhere else, as far as like music stuff. So I've been buying up a lot of that stuff now because it's like, well, this doesn't exist anywhere else. Like, how else am I going to watch it?
Right.
And it's been great, like getting to watch that stuff, and it doesn't
Totally.
it's not going to go anywhere. I own it. It's not going to disappear on the fucking
As,
internet.
as long as you use the head cleaner on your VCR, you're going to be
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I mean, before I got into music, I was a comic book guy.
yeah,
And so, and my mom's dad dabbled, like when he was retired, his sort of side hustle was doing like antique stuff. And he would do all these like car things, like not cars, but everything around cars, old car ads and memorabilia and hood ornaments and license plates and just whatever. Um, Totally not my thing, but I do have that kind of like, it's not a hoarder thing, it's a collector thing. You know what I
right.
mean? Like, I don't fucking hold on to spare parts for vacuum cleaners or whatever, just random bits of shit. But I do hold on to books, I do hold on to movies, and I do hold on to music because
Yeah,
that's what's important to me. And even sometimes, like a great afternoon for me is just like organizing records. Like it's so peaceful. Like you have a couple beers, listen to music, like organize your records, re-sleeve everything, and you're like, oh, that was a good day.
yeah. It gets your mind off everything else that's going on
Yeah,
because you're just
yeah,
focused on that one thing that like calms you down. It's
right,
nice.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's I don't know, man. I do appreciate the convenience of it, like with digital stuff. Like, don't get me
Oh,
wrong,
sure.
but man, when you just have that hankering to watch or listen to something and it's just gone, like you can't find it anywhere. Like, what are you supposed to do? Like, just sit with it. Like, damn it, singing it
And
in my head, you know?
exactly.
Ugh,
I think the biggest benefit that I've seen is that with the internet age, bands, newer bands, but especially bands from the past, are able to get evaluated a lot more fairly. Like when I was in high school, thankfully, I knew the guy that did the Necropolis fanzine that became the record label because he was in Fremont and we would go to the same shows. And
nice.
he was working with Pavement in some capacity. So I got the Demolic cassette. That long story short, I got the Demolic cassette in high school and I loved it. And but most people did not know who that band was.
Yeah.
And then fast forward, whatever, 25 years later, and people are rediscovering all this death metal stuff. And now Demilich is way bigger than they ever were in, when they were an active band, because if you just hear that record versus every other record out there, it's killer.
Yeah.
But without the promotion and the magazine and the distribution and blah, 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 you wouldn't have heard it back in the day. You just would have heard, whatever was on Roadrunner or whatever was at the fucking mall. And that was not for people that bought death metal at the mall,
Nope. Yeah, I remember for a while that CD was really hard to get and super expensive. I think it got repressed now, so it's like, more affordable. But yeah, I remember when I discovered them too. I was like, "What the fuck is this?" It was one of those things you were mentioning earlier, where like you first hear it, and you're like, "I don't know if I'm ready for that yet." And then you go back to it a few years later, and you're like, "Okay, I get this now. This fucking rules." And then it's in your repertoire of music you love.
Absolutely.
So I know you've probably talked about this ad nauseum since you've started Gruesome, but I think it's important to kind of touch on the legacy of Chuck, like what he means to you, what this band means to you because of his legacy and all of, the stuff he did for the genre. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the first thing that I guess I want to say before I go on and say a bunch of wonderful things about how much I love Chuck's work and how much I love death, because I do, is that one of the things that really irks me is this whole thing that Chuck somehow invented death metal. Like first there was silence and then Chuck farted and then all of a sudden poof, there's death metal.
Sure.
And that Scream Bloody Gore is somehow the first death metal album. That stuff really bugs me. It's kind of, I understand where it comes from because unlike a lot of the other formative bands, Chuck had a manager and a publicist and stuff in the 80s and 90s. And that was a great pitch, that was a great hook for the press. And he's deceased. So obviously that kind of makes you legendary and untouchable in a certain way that
sure.
Continuing on does not. Certainly Mantis was one of the early bands playing the more extreme style of metal, along with, of course, Possessed and Hellhammer and Necrovore and Sepultura and Sarcophago and tons more, and you look at records like Season of the Dead by Necrophagia. It came out in 87 before Scream Bloody Gore. Morbid Visions and Bestial Devastation were both already out when Scream Bloody Gore came out. Scum came out in 1987. So to think that somehow, Scream Bloody Gore is the most extreme record of even that year is ludicrous. That said, it came out at a really good time though, because Possessed was breaking up and they were sort of the most visible, most successful, certainly American band playing death metal.
Right.
And so basically, Chuck had at that point, like 4 years of tape trading, like really heavy tape trading. So there was a bunch of people that were ready to, the pump was primed when Scream Bloody Gore came out. And so it's a really significant record, not as significant as the second one. But in terms of me personally, the main thing for me was Scream Bloody Gore was probably the first death metal album I heard. I mean, aside from Celtic Frost, I guess, but it's so stylistically different. Celtic Frost is more punk and Scream Bloody Gore is more like, it's kind of like Slayer, but not really, but it's got a lot more notes and shit, even, than Celtic Frost. And I've been playing guitar, for, I don't know, at least several months, maybe a year when I heard that album. And, I was like any kid, I was fumbling through like Seek and Destroy and Am I Evil and, trying to learn, Piranha or whatever. And I really gravitated towards Celtic Frost because I could actually play those riffs,
Mm-hmm.
They weren't too precise. And they're just, you're just kind of, the strumming was easier and stuff. And when I got Scream Bloody Gore, and when I came back to it, a couple months later after I'd heard Leprosy, I started kind of realizing like that this was different. It wasn't just chromatic stuff, and there was no kind of pentatonic stuff going on, which is like the blues scale.
Yeah.
Which you still hear a ton of in Metallica and Exodus, and even Slayer occasionally. And so it kind of just changed how I thought about tonality, and certainly changed my ideas about I guess you call it harmony because it's chord progressions or whatever, even though the vocals have no melody. But it really opened my eyes to a different way of approaching writing riffs. In terms of the picking and stuff, it was like, okay, it's either speed picking or chunking, but in terms of the actual what the left hand was doing, it was incredibly eye-opening for me. Yeah. And the thing that was so cool about Death when I was growing up is that, like I said, by 88 I'd been playing guitar maybe a year, and so Chuck was always several steps ahead of me. Like I would get better. Like I would be like, oh, I can pretty much play most of the stuff on Leprosy. And then Spiritual Healing came out and I was like, holy shit. Well, fuck, this is a lot harder. And so I kind of learned in my very formative years, kind of just by like chasing after what Chuck was doing, and Rick and James, at that time. And then by the time Human came out, I'd already started my own band and we were writing our own songs, and I was less honed in on like sitting with the record, and plus I think I was certainly not good enough to play that stuff just yet. That would take a few more years. But it was really, really instructional for me and foundational for me. And as much as, with Exhumed, people have really keyed in like, oh, you guys sound like Carcass because you have the same tuning and the solos are kind of melodic and you have two vocals. But in terms of the riffing sensibility, I think it's a little closer to Death than Carcass, I would say. Mm-hmm. But it's like Death with punk, because there's no punk in Death. You know what I mean? That's the thing about Chuck, is there's no punk whatsoever. So yeah, for me personally, you can't overstate the impact those first three albums had on me. And I think what's neat about Death as a band in the broader sense is that, Chuck, he, in his sort of quest to be recognized as a real musician and to also kind of differentiate himself from all the other death metal bands that were coming up, and I'm sure he felt were kind of nipping at his heels as the 80s were turning into the 90s, he kept trying to do something different every record. And it's almost like every album sort of is its own little mini genre. The only one that maybe not quite as much as Individual Thought Patterns, because it's not as jarring a transition as the other ones. And really, I think, at least in the heavier side of metal, the only other band that's like that is like Carcass, where every album is kind of like its own little subgenre. Yeah. And that's a really fucking unique achievement. And the crazy thing is that, all of those records are good. I certainly have my favorites and my preferences, but all of them are good. And my favorites don't line up with the ones that I actually think are better.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's more about my personal experience with them, which makes the records my favorite. Yeah. But I think that's a pretty unique career trajectory, because most bands they'll do an album that starts off kind of, of the genre that they're in. And then by like the third album, they've kind of settled into what they're going to be, like Anthrax. You know what I mean? Yeah. The first album is just a speed metal album. The second album is like, well, it's still kind of basic speed metal, but it's starting to sound like Anthrax. And then by Among the Living, it's just Anthrax. You know what I mean? And it's funny because like I realized that I like speed metal more than I like Anthrax, because with each album, I'm like, well, this one's really good. This one's pretty good. I like this one. And then after that, I'm like, okay, that's enough Anthrax. For me personally, it's not that their music's bad or whatever, but it's just like, oh, I'm just more into speed metal than I am into Anthrax. Whereas Slayer, I love Slayer, like Show No Mercy speed metal, Hell Awaits is Slayer, and then Rain and Blood is like Super Slayer, you know.
Super Slayer.
And then Sternum or South of Heaven is like Slow Slayer, you know.
Yeah, Doom Slayer.
Exactly. So I don't know. It's just interesting with what Chuck was able to accomplish, and specifically, you know, the turning point between spiritual and human. You can hear the change there is that instead of Chuck being the best musician in the room, maybe not the best guitar player when James Murphy's in the room, but the best musician overall, all of a sudden on Human, he's probably the worst musician in the room,
Yeah.
which is an awesome place to be because you've got the most to learn. And you've got these three other guys that are taking Chuck's ideas that might have been kind of samey if it was still, you know, Terry and Bill and James, and turning them into something else, you know. So it's a really neat progression to sort of watch Chuck's growth as a musician. And it's been kind of surprisingly fun and rewarding to be in a tribute band to that, because every album that we do is like, okay, so this is a new project, this is a new thing that we have to get into,
Yeah.
a new headspace, a new approach. And it's you know, it's a cool journey for us as well.
Yeah, one thing I want to say is like I appreciate, you know, this being like a history kind of podcast, you know, when I do
Right.
things or talk to people. I appreciate you like pointing out the bands that came before because, you know, as important I agree that as important as Death is, you have to know where everything came before that to get to that point. And people do overlook a lot of that stuff because it's like, oh well, we know Death. That's the beginning. And it's like, well, you know, there were
Right.
even bands before Black Sabbath that were doing like heavier
Heavy rock.
stuff.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's like, you know, Black Sabbath gets the credit for the most part for starting the genre, but there were things before that. You just kind of have to look and remind people from time to time. So I appreciate you pointing that out, man. I love when people kind of like go back a little bit.
Well, it's like, you know, even I love Albert and I love Choosing Death. I think it's a great book,
Yeah.
but I do feel like he sort of glosses over the sort of 84 to 87. It's like, okay, here's a chapter on that. And then it's like, okay, now here's the book. And, you know, normally if I was just doing a gruesome interview, I wouldn't bring this up, but because it is more historical focus, the way that I look at death metal is that there's sort of what I would consider old school death metal is like 84 to 87.
Hmm.
And then I think Leprosy is the beginning of what I would call like the classic era, you
Yeah.
know, which is sort of 88 to like 92. And then from there, there's sort of a splintering, you know, from like 93 to 96. And then there's kind of a couple quiet years. And
Yeah.
then, you know, then I guess really with like 98, when like the Nile record comes out, and you know, there's Dying Fetus, Destroy the Opposition,
Shit,
and
yeah.
that kind of stuff. That's sort of the second like restarting death metal, because it had been sort of sputtering, you know. Angel Corpse and Chrysian and the bands were getting started around that time. They weren't getting started, but they were the bands that were kind of breaking out.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that very first generation, because they don't have, a lot of those bands don't have albums, they just have tapes that got traded.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Death Strike or Necrovore or Pentagram from Chile, you know, it's like they're just sort of they become footnotes. But I mean, it's like there's a thriving scene that was going on. You know, it wasn't like, oh, thrash became death metal, which became this. It's like, no, like from the very beginning, thrash and death metal were two separate things. It's
Oh
just
yeah.
thrash, you know, got signed and you could buy the tapes at the store and there was magazines writing about it. Whereas death metal, you had to like write some other pimple faced weirdo in fucking the middle of nowhere and he would send you this tape, and then that's how it worked, you know, and you get a little fucking mimeographed, you know, pamphlet. That was the press, you know.
Yeah.
So there's you know, because we think of like thrash as the underground, but there was like another layer below that. And that's really where Death, Morbid Angel, Amon, Executioner, Sepultura, all those bands. That's where they emerged from. They had been going for a few years before their first albums.
Yeah, man, I'm glad you mentioned Amon. I really love that band. They're a band like when somebody asked me for like old school death metal, I was like, go check out this record. It's so fucking good. Um, yeah, it's the kind of thing that like you would think with the internet now that stuff would be chronicled a lot better and like people would kind of remember that stuff, but it's still rare that you hear anybody like mention or talk about those first wave bands and the ones that kind of like led the way for others to come. That's just the nature of things, I guess. So with
Yeah,
you
I mean,
know,
it's also the in the internet age where you can find out about a million bands.
mhm.
It's really hard to stop and focus long enough to be like, hey, but also, did you know 37 years ago there was this band that did this really good rehearsal tape? You're like, I don't know, man. There's like 20 new albums that came out this week. Like, do I really have time for a 37-year-old rehearsal tape? And you're like, yeah, fair point.
Yeah, yeah, dude, I can't even keep up with everything now. Like
Of
it's
course,
impossible.
no one person can.
Yeah. So I guess let's talk about Gruesome. You know, it's been a few years since the last full length, 2018, but you guys have done splits and singles and EPs and stuff since then. So as far as this current record that's about to come out, how do you approach writing for this record in between doing Exhumed and everything?
Um, this record, I think, got started like three different times.
Holy shit.
um, it wasn't like we waited. We were writing songs, fairly shortly after the Twisted Prayers record, and in fact, we'd already written Fragments of Psyche before
Oh,
Twisted Prayers. That was just something I was like, oh, I guess eventually we're going to do some kind of human thing. And for whatever reason, a human type riff came to me. And so I wrote the song and I just demoed it and I was like, oh, we'll just put it away. But Sean Reinert had quit Cynic and him and Gus were super tight.
hmm.
And so Gus showed it to him and he was like, yeah, you should just play on this song, Sean. That'd be funny. And Sean's like, well, I'm not doing anything. I'm not in Cynic anymore. Like, I'll play on it. And so to me, it was like, well, when Sean Reiner wants to play drums on your human tribute song, you don't be like, well, I'm saving it for the album. It's
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, it's like, of course, let's do it. So we did that, and then Sean was originally slated to be really involved with the record that became Silent Echoes. Um, I wanted him to sort of be like the producer, not the
Hmm.
the knob moving guy and the mic choosing guy, but the guy sitting in the room being like, no, we wouldn't have done that. No, that's wrong. Or no, that's good. Do that some more or whatever.
Yeah.
Because it's like I said, him and Gus were such close friends, and it's such a unique opportunity to be in a tribute band and have access to one of the band members. Why
Seriously.
not take advantage of it, and so when Sean died, that obviously threw that plan out the window. And I don't want to speak too much for Gus, but the Cliff Notes version is that Sean and Gus started hanging out when Gus was taking lessons from him. They became friends. Gus teched for Sean for years. They were close buddies, and you know Gus was really worried about making this record because Sean's drumming is very highly regarded, and
Hmm.
rightfully so. And so he was kind of like, well, people are really going to judge me, but if I've got Sean here to help me write the drum parts and whatever, I'll feel good about it. So not only was he good, like, hey, I just lost one of my closest friends on earth, then it was like, oh, I have to make this record. Oh, and it's a tribute to one of my closest friends who just died, who's like one of the best drummers in the history of this genre, and I'm supposed to be doing what he did. And I think that really just sort of, you know, made him not want to work on the record, which is pretty understandable.
Yeah.
Um, and it also didn't help that there was a fucking pandemic. And then a
It's true.
Possessed record came out. Then an Exhumed record came out. And then Gus and I got roped into this thing playing with Terry and James, where we did spiritual healing. And then that led to us playing with Terry and Rick. We're doing leprosy. And then that turned into like multiple fucking tours. It was became ridiculous. So, you know, it was one of those things where like, oh, we're gonna work on that, and then you'd work for a month, and then 6 months later you turn around, nothing was done. And last year, Dan and Gus and I, because we are the sort of composing, recording side of the band. We got on a conference call and we're just like, look, dude, are we gonna make this fucking record or not? Because
Yeah.
if not, then like we should just be like, hey, that was a great band, that was super fun, love you guys. If a festival calls us, maybe we can do it if schedules align, but that's it. Um, and of course, we didn't want to do that because we did have a fair amount of material, written and stuff. And so I flew out to Florida, and once we actually all got in the room and rehearsed for like 4 consecutive days, all of a sudden
Hmm.
it was like, oh yeah, we have an album, we can do this. But it was just, between everything that had happened in between the records and our own fucking crazy schedules, it just became, you know, uh, just a nightmare trying to wrangle this thing into becoming something.
I can imagine. Yeah, with everybody being scattered, and yeah, obviously like losing somebody like that, that's important to everybody in the band, especially Gus. Like I can imagine just kind of wanting to step away for a little bit and just being like,
Yeah.
let's give it some time. Um, and in the end, the time that you take from that, you come back refreshed and ready to go and more inspiration and like and now here we are. The record is
Yeah.
well, it's not out yet, but I'm sure by the time people are listening to this, it'll be close to being
Right.
out.
It's imminent. It's coming out on June 6th via Relapse Records. So please, buy it, steal it, stream it, whatever. But yeah, check it out. And it's crazy because honestly, at the beginning of last year, I was like, "Fuck this record! I hate it. I'm so tired of talking about it. I'm so tired of these like half-finished songs lurking around and these riffs sitting in files somewhere." And then by the time I actually went out there and we actually played, I was like, "Oh, this is gonna be cool." Like then I felt like we actually had something. But it was just the process had gotten so frustrating, and I'm used to in Exhumed, I have a lot more of a free hand, and it's a little bit more unilateral.
Yeah.
Where I'll be like, "Hey guys, I think we're getting close to recording because I got like 9 songs," and then Sebastian's like, "Oh yeah, I got a couple," and then Ross is like, "Fuck, I only have one. Let me bang out another one." And then 3 months later, we get together and like, "Cool, here's 28 songs. Which of them are good?" And then we'll do those, and that's it. This because it is a tribute band, it's so calculated in a way. Like it has to be a thing. It can't
Yeah.
just be like, I'm interested in this. I want to play this. Cool. Do you like it? Good. Move on. It's like it has to be death stuff. And obviously it's a very high bar. And it's only, as the discography goes on, the bar, I don't know if it gets higher in terms of quality, but it gets higher in terms of the execution. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I can fucking pound a 6 pack of beer and like play Scream Bloody Gore for you, like no problem. you know, this stuff maybe not so much. It's especially considering that it was done by a bunch of exuberant, like 19 to 25-year-olds, and we're all well into our 40s at this point. So it is, it is intimidating, and it's specific. But I mean, that's part of what makes it fun too.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine too with like everybody having, other bands and things that they work on that like just coming back to this when everybody's ready is probably a good thing because you don't have to focus on it so much all the time. It's just like a
Yeah.
hey, maybe we'll do this, maybe we won't kind of deal.
And I think, if this was like my main band or my only band, I think it would be kind of frustrating because, I think of music as, it's about self-expression or whatever,
Yeah.
but this isn't really about that. This is, it's an homage, and obviously it's going to have us in it because, we're humans, we're not AI. um,
Yeah.
we're not just regurgitating something, you know, but it's more about putting the focus on the source material and being really, really respectful to it, because it means a lot to us and it means a lot to the people listening, you know?
Yeah.
So it is really fun and it is really challenging and stimulating and it is fulfilling, but not in the same way as just writing your own songs and be like, hey, this is what I'm into. That scratches a very different and sort of more natural itch, I guess, you know?
So as far as like your writing duties for Gruesome, like how do you guys split that up with like riffs? Do you just kind of each go your own way and write the riffs and then come back and kind of put a song together that way, or do you guys demo stuff out and then kind of pick and choose?
It's more demoing stuff out and picking and choosing. And it's kind of interesting because we're moving in the opposite direction of Death,
Hmm.
where, you know, on the first Death record, there's tons of songs from the demos that, you know, Rick wrote stuff on, you know, sometimes credited, sometimes not. Leprosy, almost every song Chuck and Rick worked on together. Spiritual Healing, there's a bunch of riffs that James had on there as well. And then by the time you get to Human, it's pretty much just Chuck. It's like each album becomes less, at least from the writing aspect, it becomes less collaborative and it sort of funnels down into one guy's vision. Whereas with this band, really the first record I wrote, I think almost everything, you know,
Oh wow.
um, and then Dimensions of Horror, I might have written everything, um, and then Twisted Prayers. Gus had some riffs on there. Dan had several riffs on there, and we started doing a thing where I would write a song and then I'd send it to Dan, and Dan's always like, "No, you did that already. No, no. What about this? We need a part like this." And for this record, it was much the same. Like I would kind of, you know, put the framework of a song together, and then, you know, Dan would come in, either add stuff or, you know, kind of make the material a little bit more technical. And I think each of us has a different priority, and when we're able to find something that we all like, then I think we're kind of on to something. You
Hmm.
know, Dan's thing is like he doesn't want it to be too similar to what we've done before. He wants it
That's
to be
fair.
technical. You know, he wants it to be more musically advanced because that's what Human's about. Gus, he's a he's thinking about it from the audience perspective, like from the Death fan. Like, what do Death fans want? What do Death fans identify with? And also, is it catchy? Does it have a hook? And my concern is it brutal? Is it heavy? Is it brutal? And so, if we can find something that all three of us like, then chances are it's going to be pretty good. You know, I hope, or at least, you know, it's gonna be something that will be, you know, more than the sum of its parts. I mean, it's up to the people listening to the record if it's good, but that's kind of been the criteria that we used for this album, and you know, it really kind of exceeded my expectations. So hopefully, you know, people like it.
I'm really curious about the opening track too, Condemned Identity. So
Uh huh.
that opening, just like clean guitar riff. I mean, dude, the tone on that sounds so good, and then it just
It
goes
does.
bam right into the song. Who wrote that part, and like how did that come together? Because I love the way the album opens.
Yeah, Dan wrote that part, and I had come up
Sick.
with a clean intro that I thought was really good, and I was like, "Yeah, I got it. This is awesome." And then Dan showed me his, and I was like, "Oh fuck, this is way better than mine. Fuck." And
It
I
is
was
really
just,
good. I'm sorry.
it's really good, right? Um, and you know, obviously, we didn't want to start with a drum intro. We didn't want to start in the same way Human did, but we wanted to start in a way that clearly signaled that this album is an homage to Human.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I thought it was perfect. And you know, I had this whole thing in my head where there was gonna be this whole fade up, like, and then we were gonna go. And Dan's like, no, there's nothing. I was like, there can't just be nothing. And so thankfully Gus put in the drum roll, and I was like, okay, all right, because I thought it was just too. It was a little too jarring
Yeah.
with to just go from the clean guitar right into the song. So I don't know. I think it's a cool sort of declaration that this is a new territory for us. I mean, obviously, it's still in the death catalog, but we're in a different sector now, and we're doing different things. And it's a real nice, it's a nice statement. But the song itself is pretty fucking aggressive. It's
Oh yeah.
comes out swinging.
So as far as guitar tones and stuff, like trying to keep it sounding like mostly like Chuck's tones, like do you guys do that purposely, or are you still trying to kind of like make it just, just a little bit different to where it's like kind of your own at the same time?
Well, it's not that it is a little bit different, but it's not in service of making it our own.
Mhm.
It's kind of like if the record sounded exactly like sonically like Human, it would be weird because that was
Yeah, it would.
recorded in 1991. And even though you think that's what you want to hear, that's not actually what you want to hear. You want to hear something that feels like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, simply by virtue of the recording methods, we're not sitting here and quantizing the drums and doing all that kind of shit,
Right.
but we're using Pro Tools. You know what I mean? Like we're using some outboard effects and then some effects that are in the box, and we're trying to take sort of the tools and convenience of a lot of the modern studio technology and use it in service of this nostalgic feeling. Um, but to record the album analog and do all that shit, it's way more expensive. It's way more time consuming, and it's just why, you know what I mean? Like nobody
To
will
be,
care,
yeah,
you
no.
know. Um, like
Especially in this day
five
and age.
audio nerds will like it, and then four audio nerds will be mad because they wanted a different tape machine. So I don't care about that. So we try to, we try to take the start with the original with the source material and then sort of build up from there and beef it up, and and not to malign any of the original stuff, but to learn from some of the things that I don't know if they're mistakes or they're unintentional or they're just things like I don't know if you would really want to do that,
Sure.
like the snare drum on Leprosy. I love it, but it's not sonically a good decision. Um, so we wouldn't want that, you know what I mean? We wouldn't want an element like that. We want it to sound, we want it to be able to stand up to records that are coming out now while still feeling nostalgic because, it's just we've been talking about this forever in this band. It's like when you go see The Force Awakens, right?
Hmm.
You don't want it to look like it's shot on a fucking movie camera from 1977.
No.
Like you don't, but you want it to hit those same beats. There's a giant bass. They got to blow it up. Somebody says they got a bad feeling about this. Like there's a fucking, the wipe dissolve, whatever. And, that's kind of what we're in the business of doing is not doing the exact same thing, but doing something that feels the exact same. And so it's a fine line to walk, especially with the technical stuff, because it would be really, pretty easy to use modern production to make something that's, I don't know, more polished or just more punchy, whatever. But that's not what we want to do. We want to use it to to build on what was there, but not to go full new school.
Yeah, because I do think that this is a common complaint that I see sometimes on the internet is that some records nowadays just sound too perfect. And it takes a lot of like the authenticity out of it in a way. In my opinion, I'm not saying that other people are saying this, and there's nothing wrong with that. I totally understand bands that want to do that, but sometimes, man, you just need that little bit of rawness and like little bit of like pulling it back just to make it not too perfect, if that makes sense.
No, it's something that we talk about in all of my bands a lot,
Hmm.
especially because Dan is an audio engineer, Gus is an audio engineer, in Exhumed, Sebastian is an audio engineer. Um, I, we have our own recording studio. I wouldn't call myself an audio engineer, but I'm not the worst engineer. Um, and my fear is that because the technology is there and because you're able to do so much of it in a way that's cheap, you know what I mean? Like you can sit on your laptop in your room and record all the guitars through a DI and then
Yeah.
reamp them later. And you can play it until it's completely perfect. And my question is, does that really enhance the audience's experience of the music, or does it just present you in the best light, like girls that take 500 selfies and then put filters on them so that they look they think people want on Instagram or whatever?
Right.
And not just girls, I shouldn't say that sounds sexist, dudes do it too. I see people at the fucking gym do it every day.
Oh God, I can imagine.
And my thing is that if I look at records that I love, I actually don't really care about good playing, and I don't care about musicianship. I love musicianship,
Yep.
and I want to play as good as I can, and I love records made by great musicians, but I also like records made by fucking drunk 16-year-olds. And even records that have sold truckloads of copies. I mean, like Zeppelin is one of my favorite bands, and dude, some of fucking Page's playing is shit. It's just so sloppy. It's all string noise.
Yeah.
Like there's a couple bits that like that part. I listen to that and I'm like, I would have done another take, dog. But it's on the radio every day and everybody loves it, and it's sold millions and jillions of records, and I love it. And so I'm like, all this stuff is not really in service of the music, it's in service of the people's egos making it. And the other thing is that once, in the 80s, it was novel to hear a record with great production.
Yeah.
When Master of Puppets came out, it was like, holy shit, I've never heard anything this tight, whatever. And then it, continued to kind of get better from there. And I think every band, especially in death metal, because you start out with no budget, you hear from Abominations of Desolation to Covenant. I mean, what a fucking difference. Covenant sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Abominations of Desolation sounds like shit. So of course you want your band to sound as good as possible, but now that that's easy, that's sort of I don't know. It's not interesting anymore. It doesn't sound huge. If everything sounds huge, nothing sounds huge. And I'm much more interested in hearing a record that sounds honest. And it's certainly like not for this band, because like I said, this is not about what I want, but like we're almost done recording the new Exhumed album, and there's just takes that I'm doing as I'm recording, and I'm like, I'm just going to leave it. It's not like an egregious mistake or something horrible.
Sure.
But you hear the string noise, you hear the hand moving on the strings, or there's like some of the speed picking at extreme tempos is not lining up, and I'm like, I'm just going to leave it because I don't care. And I don't think it's important. I could sit here for an hour and get it right or whatever, but it's like at the end of the day, it's not going to enhance anyone's enjoyment of the music. It's just going to make me be like, oh, I'm a really good guitar player. Huh? And who gives a shit about that,
Yeah, who's listening that closely? And even if they are, sometimes like if I've ever caught something like that, it's like, oh, that's kind of cool that they messed up there. Or, like,
and they just left it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple bands that I listen to, man. Like they leave those string, like you can hear them just like ripping on the strings when they're doing those riffs, and I was like, oh, I love that. I love hearing that. It's authentic.
It makes you feel like you're in the room, because I remember watching Vector years ago. Great band, amazing players, and I was watching them live, and I was like, man, I wish their records sounded like this, because the records are a little sterile, and just hearing them live sounded so fucking good. And they're playing incredibly proficiently and everything. It wasn't about like, oh, I wish they would fuck up. It was just like, I just want to hear the sound of people playing instruments in a room, and maybe not worrying about a rim shot, or not worrying about, a slightly out of time punch or something, because it's like, everywhere around us, everything is becoming more synthetic, more artificial, more computerized, more perfect, and less, I don't know, I feel less connected to everything as a result of that. I mean, and that's something that, Chuck would write lyrics about even back in the 90s, with 1,000 Eyes and stuff like that. And the idea of even genetic reconstruction in this quest for perfection. Like, what are we losing? What we're losing is our connection to ourselves and to each other. And I don't know. Maybe I'm just old and not with it, and that's fine too. I don't know, but that's my take.
No, I'm kind of with you because it's now leading to this weird era of music, especially with like social media musicians.
Right.
That's like a thing. But like now, there's all these people like faking their playing and getting like millions of views, and then they get called out on it, and they're like, "Yeah, whatever, I fake my playing. So what? You guys still watch it?" It's like what? Because I mean, it just sounds so perfect. It's weird, man. It's so weird. I don't get
Yeah.
it, but that's where we're at in
I mean,
some parts of it.
no, we live in a time where fake reality or fantasy, whatever you want to call it, has gotten better and better and better and better. And now we're at a sort of tipping point where it's in danger of, you know, hijacking our relationship with the world that we're actually in. I
Yeah.
mean, and every generation is different. The threshold, for my parents who are in their 70s, all they got to do is just sit in front of Fox News every day to lose touch with reality, but but it's just the media is becoming so sophisticated, and I love it. As like I said, I was a comic book guy, so I mean, like, I love going to the movies and seeing a dude make a fucking energy bolt out of his hands and it looks real. It's like, yeah.
Hell yeah.
um However, the idea of like deep fakes and everything else, it's just turning everything into something fake. And I think one of the things that I loved about metal is that it's supposed to be a place that pushes back against all that. And when you hear, and when I think about AI making music, the first metal AI album, I mean, it's going to sound like an Andy Sneap production. And Andy Sneap's productions are great. They sound amazing. However, they funneled everything into this really narrow kind of sound dynamic, this narrow aesthetic that is objectively really, really good. But then once you're able to replicate it, then it just becomes so stale and boring. I mean, I thought Morrisound productions were boring in 92. I was like, I don't want to hear that fucking kick drum ever again. Like, stop. Um, Nowadays it's just like, I'll hear records and I'm like, I like this song, but I don't want to listen to it because it's so sterile and boring and perfect, and the drums sound fucking bullshit. So
Yeah, the drums thing has been really weird too, where they just sound like they're nothing but clicks. You don't hear like the actual bass hits on the drums, and that's kind of where I'm like, I don't know, the drums don't do it for me. But man, when you can get like a really good like tone on the bass drums, that's all I
right.
need.
I mean, there's bands playing live that don't use kick drums. They just
Yeah.
have a fucking little thing that the pedal hits to cause the trigger. And I'm like, is it more honest because you're hearing the trigger and not the kick drum anyway? I mean, in a way, it is kind of honest, but it just kind of sucks.
Yeah, I guess it makes it sound a little weaker in my opinion. Like just I don't know.
And it also just shows that it's like, yeah, it's not about the instrument anymore. It's just about this technological tool. And we're not even going to bother with the pretense of the instrument because we don't feel like loading it up, the 5 stairs from the floor to the stage.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm not trying to throw too much mud on other bands here. I'm not naming any bands, but now there's this huge thing in a lot of modern metal too, where you see and hear bands playing completely to backing tracks, like pop
Right.
music. To me, that feels incredibly disingenuous. Like I don't want to go to see a band to hear a backing track. I can stay at home and listen to the album and do that.
Right.
Like, and also in a way, it feels kind of insulting to other bands that are like actually up there playing their instruments, busting their ass every night for 2, 3 months out of the year, and they're huge. Like these bands are huge, and I have to imagine like you probably run into that, wouldn't you? Or is that something that doesn't
I
really
see it.
happen in your circle?
I see it. I try to make sure it's not in my circle, but of course I see it. And I saw something from Tom Warrior from Celtic Frost
Yeah.
that summed it up really nicely. And he's like, well, the difference is I want to go see a concert. I don't want to see a show. And if
Mm,
you're going to see a show, then it doesn't really matter about the backing tracks.
okay.
And even bands that don't use tracks or use limited tracks like Behemoth or whatever, it's a show because there's 8 million sort of seizure inducing lights going on at all times and this and that, which I don't particularly care for.
Sure.
But the thing is, once you cross over into a sort of more mainstream audience, it's becomes a show, not necessarily a concert. And even bands that I love, like Maiden, they're playing. It's just them, you know. But there is also a show, and that I like a lot. I
Right.
love. It's like, look at this dude. There's a fucking plane, and there's a 10-foot monster, and he's got a flag, and he's jumping up and down, and these stupid looking pants. It's like, this is great, but it's not just a show. It's still a band playing music, and
And
that's
they've
one of
always
the
been
things.
that way.
Yeah, and my favorite band is Metallica,
Okay.
and they're also one of the most maligned bands of all time. And that's great. It's fair. There's a million things you could say about them. That's great. The one thing that you can say about them is it's always just the four of them. That's all you fucking hear. And that's why
Yeah.
when people are like, oh, Lars can't play. Oh, they're out of tune. Oh, this is that. I'm like, would you rather hear that, or would you rather go see Motley Crue and hear fucking 47 backing tracks and like maybe Mick Mars? Like, I would rather hear fucking Kirk go out of tune on da
Yeah.
da 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 da, like, because then I know I'm seeing a thing. Like, this is a thing that's happening right now, and that's something I feel really strongly about. Like, I get if you have all this extra instrumentation that's part of your sound, it's not practical to travel with a string quartet.
Yeah, that part I completely agree with too. Like you don't need a whole
But
fucking symphony to come with you.
right, but the idea of having extra guitars and having there's bands that just put the bass on tracks, and
Hmm.
it's just like, dude, what? Or there's an extra kick drum on a track to beef up the fucking thing, and it's just like, man, it's so choreographed. And obviously we record to a click, even in Exhumed.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, every few years, someone will float the idea of like, what do you think about like maybe playing to a click live? And I'm just like, nope. And it's like, well, sometimes we play too fast and we fuck up. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but like, let's just leave it. Let's just
That's
let
fun
it be.
though.
Yeah, I just want it to be a real thing, and that's my concern. It's like, technology is this amazing tool, but it we have to make sure that it remains a tool and not a replacement, because there's so many people that are lazy enough and cynical enough to just use it, like you said, the fake guitar playthrough video guy,
Yeah.
just like, yeah, I did that, and take credit for it, and people will give them praise or give them more money or whatever it is that they're in for. And it's that it's just so ripe for abuse. And that's the thing. And I don't mean to sound like an old curmudgeon or fuddy-duddy.
No.
I think it's great. There's tons of stuff that I do now musically that I never would have been able to do without technology of today. It's a wonderful tool that everybody should be using. You should just be using it in service of what you're doing, not as a replacement for what you're doing.
Yeah, and I don't think you sound like an old man. Like I think these are important things to kind of bring up because they're kind of, it's coming up more and more. So I just kind of like to
Yeah.
get people's opinions on those things because I see it, I run into it, and like I feel certain ways about it, and you know, it's good to talk about it, I think.
I think it becomes important because it's about, in this genre, in underground music, it's a it's supposed to be an alternative from all the fake manufactured
Yeah.
trendy bullshit that's out there. And certainly it's a trend-based industry, having been listening to metal since the late 80s. You see the churn and you see the turnover, and it's like, death metal's popular. No, 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 death metal sucks. Now black metal is popular. No, 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 that sucks. Then it's this, whatever. And it's an industry that, like any other, there's going to be trends, there's going to be things, but it's supposed to be the place where you go away from everything being slick and perfect and manufactured and pretty and nice to someplace gritty and raw. And sometimes it might be like, oh, I don't know, this is a little weird or something I'm not comfortable with, or maybe it's going to challenge your ideas about religion or whatever it might be. But it's supposed to be a place that is real.
Yeah.
And when you start adopting these tools that make the fucking fake mainstream, glitzy shit, it's almost more disingenuous in metal because, you know what I mean? Nobody thinks, oh, I go to a Chapel Roan show because I just want to see this drummer play because he's so good. They're like, no, you just want to yell pink pony girl and fucking do MDMA and get drunk and rub up on chicks and or rub up on dudes or whoever's there because anything goes. That's great. It's a party. It's a
Yeah.
show. That's not what it's for. But if you're going to a death metal show, ostensibly you're going to see the music performed by the musicians. And when that starts slipping away, then the difference between a death metal show and a Chapel Roan show becomes, at least a Chapel Roan show is honest about just being entertainment for entertainment's sake and not trying to go like, yeah, we're gritty and against everything. It's like, no, you're not. You're fucking using the same bullshit that these other people are using.
Yeah.
They're just being like, yeah, it's bullshit. We're just here to fucking have a party, and that's great. So I think that's the danger is subverting the real value that this music has, you know.
Yeah, I do think that, you know, metal's not really ever gonna get to that point where it's like completely falsified, or not falsified, but you know,
Right.
faked or whatever, you
Manufactured.
know. Yeah, it's not gonna get to that point, but it's like it's treading a dangerous ground where it's like, you know, how far do you want to push it? Where it's
Right.
like keeping it authentic, I think that'll never go away. That's like the heart of everything that is in heavy metal, I think.
Right. And that's the part that you know, we got to preserve. And you know, there's always going to be a push pull. There's going to be younger people that are more comfortable using these tools in different ways, and there's going to be
Yeah.
older people that aren't. And then there's the flip side. There's gonna be younger people who are like, fuck all that. You know, like where I live, there's a bunch of really good like grindcore bands full of, you know, like 22-year-olds. And they're even the Exhumed record, they're like, why do you need 3 guitar tracks? There's only 2 of you. Why don't you just have 2? I was like, okay. um, and then I think out of all 4 is the worst, which is going to be the older generation trying to use the new tools, because that's when it gets really cringeworthy. You know, that's when you end up with a record like Demolition by Judas Priest, who's one of my favorite bands of all time, but that's one of the most embarrassing records ever recorded by anybody. So,
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Iron Maiden has a weird record like that too, where they recorded like, man, I forget what it is now. But yeah, I know about the Demolition record, but I know there was one that Iron Maiden did that was really fucking weird, and then like they tried a bunch of VR shit way before VR was even like a thing, and like it flopped
that's
really
always
hard. It was like early '90s, mid '90s maybe, after
maybe
Fear of the
like
Dark.
Patrol 11 or whatever, one of those. I don't
Maybe, yeah, yeah. I remember reading about it and I was just like, holy shit, like cannot believe this ever got made, but it did.
It was a weird time. You know, 90s was a weird time.
All right, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I just want to end on like one last little thing here. I know you're like a big comic and horror guy. What are some things you've watched recently that have like been awesome to you that you've enjoyed?
Let's see. Um, It's the last I saw Warfare in the theater, and I thought that was a really interesting movie.
Hmm.
I guess technically it's horror. It's really
Okay.
more almost like feels like a suspense thriller to me because it's just so fucking tense.
Yeah.
I remember I was like, I feel kind of uncomfortable. Like I've been stuck in this room for like 2 hours. Like, oh my God. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if I loved the movie, but I really liked what it was doing. Um, I also, you know, watch a lot of old stuff that I missed the first time or was, you know, was from before my time that maybe wasn't gory enough for me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Um, Not too long ago, I finally saw Twins of Evil, the old Hammer picture,
Oh shit.
um, which in terms of like older horror that I've seen recently, that one really stood out as I really liked it. I was like, this is it's not just campy and silly and fun. It's also like a really good movie. It's not just an excuse to see like 60s tits or whatever.
Yeah.
Although there's some glorious 60s tits in it, but it's also just a kick-ass movie. Um, you know, but I watch you know, like I said, a lot of old stuff on like Tubi and Amazon Prime, just shit that
Dude,
I never got around to seeing.
Tubi is like a
Uh,
gold mine for old horror stuff. I fucking love it. I'm always just
yeah,
like, what is this? Let's watch it. Oh, that was amazing. Like, you know?
yeah, my watch list is just it's ridiculous. I saw I've never seen I don't know if it's Cronenberg's first movie. I think it's called Shivers, the one about the
Yeah.
apartment complex. I'd somehow never seen that, and I saw that recently, and I loved it. I saw a movie called Road Games with Stacy Keach and Jamie Lee Curtis really early in their careers,
Yeah.
and they're like Australia. He's an American trucker in Australia trying to get meat across the country during a meat strike, but there's a serial killer, and it actually is a really good and fun film. Um, so yeah, I mean, I watch a lot of that stuff, and I do watch all the fucking superhero stuff because I just can't help myself. Um, the last Daredevil show was kind of a mixed bag, but it was pretty good. Um,
Dude, I just mainlined all that stuff because it just got put on Hulu. So I
oh,
watched
nice.
Daredevil, Punisher to the new season of Daredevil, and it was like the best week of my life watching all that stuff.
That first season of Punisher, and I'm not even a Punisher fan. That first
Right.
season of Punisher is so good.
Yeah.
Um, and like the last, they did a new Spider-Man cartoon this year. Yeah, I still watch cartoons, and I found it really charming. Sometimes I'll watch this stuff and I'm like, man, I wish I had a kid so I could watch this with him.
Yeah.
Because it's way better than the cartoons I had when I was a kid.
Oh man.
So, I watch a lot of stuff, and I read a lot of mostly old comics and stuff still. Um, both horror and superhero stuff. I went
Mhm.
on a huge binge. There was a company called Skywald in the 70s, and all their comics are in the public domain, so they're super easy to find. And they're kind
Oh
of like,
shit.
it starts off as like a creepy, eerie kind of knockoff, and then it kind of gets its own groove and becomes this really weird, quirky, very 70s, horror magazine stuff. And so that was really cool. And I try to keep reading and keep watching, and it's hard to find time to dedicate hours a day on top of family life, work, blah 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 blah. But
Yeah.
again, the access, and that's the other thing, is we have so much access to it now. Like I said, sometimes I'll just be like, "Oh, watch something," and then I'll spend 10 minutes lining stuff up in the queue, and then I'm like, "Oh, I ate my whole lunch already." All right, well, back to work.
Yeah, that's the fun part about it though. It's like because you got stuff to go back on later and watch. It's like,
Yep,
all right, we'll
it's
get
an
to that when it's
infinite
there, unless it
smorgasbord.
disappears.
Right.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you for coming back on the podcast, dude. As far as Gruesome, where can everybody find all that stuff when it's out? And I guess if you can say, you said you're recording the new Exhumed record.
We are.
When will that be out? If you can
Uh,
say.
the new Exhumed record we're looking at early next year.
Okay.
Most of the recording is done because we're able to do it all at home. We're just kind of lackadaisical. Like it was like a bunch of intense work. We're like, hey, we're almost done, and then you just sort of let the rest sit, because human nature.
Yeah.
And also, it's not pressing. There's no real deadline, but early next year is the plan. And we're kind of lining up some stuff in terms of road work around that. The Gruesome Record is called Silent Echoes. It drops on June 6th, of course, on Relapse Records. You can find us. Most things is like hash, / gruesome death metal. I know that's like Bandcamp and
Yep.
Facebook. We had to change our Instagram. I think it's Gruesome Band Official, um, because somehow we lost the password for our old one and none of us
Oh
could
shit.
figure it out, and we got locked out. So we had to start a new one. But yeah, we're on all the things, and of course, Relapse will be, they've been doing a great job promoting the record. So I'm sure, if you're looking for us and can't find us, just go to Relapse, and we won't be too far off there.
Yeah.
And we're planning a bunch of dates in the next several months. We'll be out in the States and hopefully beyond very soon. So we should have something to announce, in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Awesome, man. Well, yeah, dude. Thank you seriously for doing this again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.